Throughout the centuries, conflict has always existed between the people and the government. Even some countries that we see today, with stable governments, went through revolutions and uprisings to get to where they are today. The most famous revolution is possibly the American Revolution against Britain, but this certainly was not the only influential revolution in our world's history. One of the less well known but still important and influential revolutions was the Russian Revolution. Many factors played key roles in the collapse of the imperial regime and the revolutions of February and October. Among these were the weakening of the autocracy, the search for greater autonomy on the part of non Russian groups, the work of revolutionary organizations, and the demoralization due to war losses.
I think that one of the factors of the Russian Revolution was the backwardness of Russia at the time. I see it somewhat as a punishment for the leaders' arrogance of power and the misdirected desperation of the oppressed.
In the years leading up to the Russian Revolution, Russia was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II after the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905. The commoners were not content with the immense power of the Tsar, so they revolted. This became the first Russian Revolution of 1905. It forced the Tsar to allow for the creation of the National Assembly, Duma. However, its power was limited and did not please the Tsar or the reformers. On August 3rd, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, starting the Great World War. After some serious defeats by the Germans in hostile Duma, Tsar Nicholas II declared himself commander-in-chief of the army in 1950. The only way that the Russians could pay for the war was to print more paper money. This inflation increased the misery of the urban working class.
Most of the industrial workers were women. They were especially angry at the Tsar for not addressing this issue, as well as the problem of inflation.
The effects of the war went beyond the losses of the army. The commoners were suffering from starvation, inflation, and a torrent of refugees. Both soldiers and civilians blamed the incompetence of the Tsar and his government. This hatred towards the government grew until December 30th, 1916, when the Tsar is warned that his army will not support him against the revolution. Starving women and children lined the streets of Petrograd on March 8th, 1917, marking the beginning of the February Revolution. Tensions had arisen to their breaking point as the 90,000 protesters put their government to the test. Many factors contributed to this great uprising, but most of all, the people of Russia had had enough of their government and enough of being pushed aside.
Russia was in a very disoriented state at this time. People everywhere were starving, and um, it's no wonder that the people had lost hope in their military. I think that if Russia had not been so heavily involved in World War One, that the people might not have been so inclined to revolt.
Russia's involvement in the war was what most angered all the people in Russia, whether they were radicals or not. They faced an internal as well as external collapse, with Soviet forces being severely beaten on the battlefield and the Tsar refusing to help the cause of the oppressed. Tsar Nicholas dissolved the Duma once again, further infuriating the masses. Revolutionaries clashed with the police, but on March 11th, several protesters were killed by the Petrograd army garrison. Nicholas dissolved the Duma again that same day.
As protests occurred throughout the city, many of the troops began to refuse to subdue the riots, and they even began to shoot each other. Now, this moment in the revolution was decisive because the Tsar now has no power over his army. Because all this was happening, the imperial government actually resigns, and this leads the Duma to create the provisional government.
This new government worked together with the Petrograd Soviet to try to stop the protests, even though they were largely at odds with one another. At first, the government was led by a liberal aristocrat, Prince Gregory Yevgenyevich Lvov. But after Gregory's government failed, socialist Alexander Kerensky, a Menshevik, came into power.
Now, on March 14th, the Petrograd Soviet issues Order Number 1. This was basically their first order, and it said that all soldiers and sailors were not allowed to obey any commands that contradicted the Petrograd Soviet. I find this to be one of the boldest steps that they took in the February Revolution because they'd always kind of been afraid to act out against the provisional government for fear that the government would take away their power, and so this was one of the turning points in their rise to power.
Nicholas was headquartered in Mogilev before the February Revolution, and upon trying to return to Petrograd to quiet the riots, the Duma had turned against him and prevented him from boarding his train. Nearly 1 month later, Nicholas has no other choice but to step down from the throne. He attempts one last time to save his monarchy by offering his throne to his brother, but in vain. On March 15th, he abdicates the throne and is taken along with his family to the Ural Mountains, where he is doomed to house arrest. In the early part of July, widespread discontent in the Petrograd led to militant demonstrations calling for the overthrow of the provisional government.
Throughout the course of history, there are many cases where discontentment among people led to defiance. Now, this shows that it's an urge that no human can really resist, the urge to be over your superiors. These people in Russia were tired of being mistreated, and it pushed them towards defiance.
The Bolshevik leaders opposed these demonstrations as premature, but they ended up leading some of the demonstrations to avoid bloodshed. This was done because they wanted to win the trust of the workers and because many of the Bolshevik rank and file were already organizing and supporting the demonstrations.
The term survival of the fittest comes into play in that they knew what they had to do to survive, and I personally respect that. What I don't respect, however, is that they forgot their morals.
The troops loyal to the provisional government suppressed the demonstrations violently. This crackdown led to the Kerensky government ordering the arrest of the Bolshevik leadership on July 19th. Lenin escaped capture, went into hiding, and wrote State and Revolution, which outlined his ideas for a socialist government. The repression against the Bolsheviks ended because the Kerensky government was threatened by a rebellion led by General Kornilov. They reached out to Kornilov and urged him not to attack. He stood down, and he was later taken into custody.
It is obvious that the Bolsheviks would not go down without a fight. They actually enlisted 25,000 men in their militia. According to most history books and research that has been done, the Bolsheviks were given weapons by the Kerensky government in order to defeat Kornilov and his men. After this, they actually kept the weapons that were given to them so that they would never stop having a strong military. I think this was a very wise move for two main reasons. One was that obviously they would need them for future battles, and the second is that now they didn't actually have to rely on anyone else to give them weapons in the future.
During this time, a situation of dual leadership developed, while the legislature and provisional government were controlled by Kerensky in coalition with the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the workers and the soldiers. Soviets were increasingly under the control of the Bolsheviks. The October Revolution is maybe more well known as the Bolshevik Revolution. It is the Bolsheviks taking over the socialist movement and destroying the Kerensky provisional government. It began on October 10, 1917, when the non-secret Counter-Revolutionary Society, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies, began a military force. This was called the MRC, or the Military Revolutionary Society, and was created to all those who were against another revolution.
I find one of the greatest mistakes that the provisional government ever made was a refusal to act on the MRC. They knew about the Petrograd Soviet, well, nearly everyone did, but did nothing against it. I think that if they had opposed it now, in its very beginning, they would have stood a greater chance later. The government didn't really have a military at the time, but if they had started even a small one now to oppose the MRC, they would have been better protected later on.
One of the first Bolshevik uprisings was on October 23rd in Tallinn, Estonia. Many of the Bolsheviks came to seclusion in hiding and worked towards taking over power. This is one of the first examples of Soviets taking over. It was almost like the pushing of a rock to start an avalanche. It showed all the Bolsheviks that they could take over without the help of the other more conservative revolutionaries.
On October 24th, the provisional government sought to arrest Trotsky, the initiator of the MRC. The soldiers of the provisional government broke into buildings, destroying mainly newspapers and printing presses. This act caused strife in the MRC, with opposing views of how to act on it. The Bolsheviks wished to fight directly, while others wanted to watch and wait. The dawn of October 25th came, and Vladimir Lenin came out of hiding. All throughout the day, Soviets came out and began rallying in front of the Winter Palace in Petrograd, the home of the provisional government. At 9:45 in the evening, the attack on the palace, loosely guarded by 300 drunk and lazy soldiers, began. The fight was started by an empty shell shot off the cruiser Aurora. It was with this sign that all the men on the land and in the ships began attacking the Winter Palace. The fight was not a difficult one for the Soviets. Most of the guards fled or joined forces with their attackers. Meanwhile, in an upstairs dining room, the members of the provisional government cowered under tables as they knew their arrest was soon to follow. In 4 hours, the Soviets found their way to the room and captured them all. Many of the Red Guard Soviets spent their time in the palace destroying everything, the glass china and crystals which had once been prized possessions of the Romanovs. The Second Congress of Soviets was underway that night in the Great Hall of Smolny. Little did the company of 300 Bolsheviks, 370 Mensheviks, and 80 Bolshevik allies know that this night would be the beginning of Soviet Russia. The illegal taking of power, administered mainly by the Bolsheviks, was met with much anger and frustration by the Mensheviks in Congress. They feared that this act would start a military counter-revolution, which would in turn slow or even stop the Soviet Revolution. Due to the Bolsheviks' refusal to listen to their complaints, the Mensheviks, who were the only conservatives in Congress, left in a storm, leaving the power of the entire revolution in Bolshevik hands.
It was this desertment by the Mensheviks that ultimately left Russia with only one choice. I think that if the Mensheviks had stayed and worked through all of their disagreements with the Bolsheviks, the outcome of Russia would have been drastically different.
I think that although the Mensheviks leaving probably affected Russia's change to being Soviet, I don't think that it was the specified changing moment. I think that Russia was probably going to turn Soviet whether or not the Mensheviks left.
It was now late into the night when the now Bolshevik Congress sent a proclamation written by Lenin by telegram to all of Russia. It informed the citizens that the provisional government had been overthrown by the MRC. On the morning of October 26, 1917, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers was convened, and Lenin rejoined them, and plans for Soviet Russia were begun. Ideas for land and peace were set forth, many of which were quickly elected. The Bolsheviks proposed a new plan for the Soviet government, which was greatly disliked by many, but was chosen nonetheless. A new Congress was proclaimed, the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, made up of 62 Bolsheviks and 29 Soviet Russians. The government was controlled by the Soviet of People's Commissioners, of which Lenin was elected chairman, giving him near complete control over the entire nation. And so, through a revolution, the country of Russia changed from a tsardom to a Soviet nation.